Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang, and joining me here in the studio is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Good to be back.
Thank you for being here. South Korea's National Assembly is now deliberating over its budget bill for 2019, and the Moon Jae-in government's proposal to add 170,000 new jobs to the public sector by the year 2022 has been at the center of a heated controversy.
이번에 증언되는 공무원 증언 분야는 주로 소방, 경찰, 복지 등 그동안 우리나라에서 정말 수요가 부족했다고 말해줬던 분야들입니다. 그 공공 서비스의 만족도를 높임으로써 전반적인 우리 대한민국의 삶의 질을 높이는 데 굉장히 큰 역할을 하고 있습니다.
일자리 늘리겠다. 17만 미리 숫자를 정해놓고 그래서 그 출발점부터 문제가 있다. 그리고 세금으로 공무원을 늘린 것은요. 이제 그렇게 말하지 않습니까? 초등학생도 할 수 있는 일이다. 목이 마르다고 바닷물을 마시는 행위입니다.
This was all a part of President Moon Jae-in's campaign pledge during the elections to add a total of 810,000 government jobs. So in this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we take a closer look at this proposal, as well as the popularity of public sector jobs here in South Korea compared to that in countries across the world. Competition is rather high among young South Koreans to land a public sector job and is showing no signs of cooling down. Many recent surveys indeed show that the youth have a clear preference to work for the government. So when did you, during your stay here in South Korea, when did you get a feel for this preference to land a government job?
Well, it happened for me pretty early on. When I first came to Korea, after about a year, I was teaching at a university, and I was teaching freshmen mostly, and there was a preference amongst those that I taught to prepare themselves for two different job paths. One was get a job with a big company, get a job with one of the family-owned conglomerates here, one of the chaebol. That was the first choice because it paid well and it was also viewed as being fairly secure. And the other one was to get a job in the public sector, a so-called iron rice bowl, as it's been referred to here in South Korea.
And what about for you, Sakabe?
Yeah, I think so. I met one person who got a doctorate degree in U.S. in biosector. He said to me that he tried to find a job in a private company.
In Korea or in the US?
In Korea, but he gave up. Now he's working in the institution which is under umbrella of government. But he said to me, he's very happy, he's very lucky. This is a reality.
And Fred, what was your experience?
I mean, something that always impresses me is to see the number of people here who are preparing for to become a civil servant. I mean, and sometimes you see people who are like overqualified, applying for like very, very simple jobs within the civil sector just because they want to enter the civil sector. And this is something that is sometimes a bit surprising.
Yeah.
Another thing that I recall is when I lived around Seoul National University, there were a whole bunch of these study rooms where people would go, recent university graduates would go to spend a year or sometimes 2 years or even longer studying for the next exam. In Canada, we don't have those types of sort of cram library study locations where people prepare for these types of tests.
Right, because they do have to absorb a ridiculous amount of information for those exams. So with this growing preference to work for the public sector, there's now an increasing number of people who are studying for the national service exams. Statistics show that a whopping 40% of all young job seekers here in South Korea are prepping for these exams. But the path to becoming a public servant is lined with many obstacles. Studying for the exams can take years, and applicants face cutthroat competition. And some critics worry that this growing desire to become a public servant reflects a loss in dynamism and enterprise among young South Koreans simply for the sake of job security. So what are your thoughts on this overall preference for public sector jobs?
I mean, I find this criticism really unacceptable. I mean, if your choice is to get a stable job, why would you be criticized for not everybody can have a like entrepreneurship spirit? So this argument is, I find it a bit difficult to swallow, to tell the truth. And I think, especially in Korea, where you see a tremendous amount of entrepreneurs and a lot of creativity, so I don't see why having more people applying for the civil servant exam somehow hinders the creativity and the entrepreneurship of other people. I just don't believe in that.
So you think that argument is rather unfounded?
Oh yeah.
What about for you, Frank?
Well, I feel a little bit differently than Fred. I don't think that there's enough entrepreneurship, genuine entrepreneurship in South Korea. I think the chaebol have far too much dominance of the South Korean economy. And people need to be more creative in their entrepreneurship here.
Then Frank, do you think this lack of entrepreneurship is somehow related to this preference for the government sector jobs?
Obviously, if you have more people heading into the public sector, they are more risk averse, let's say, than entrepreneurs who are not that worried, let's say, about supporting a family, and they're not that worried about immediate income, and they're willing to take the risk of putting in some work without guaranteed, long-term income or even short-term income. And South Korea, generally, economies need more people like that in order to grow their economies.
Yeah, but what I mean, you cannot blame the lack of entrepreneurship in an economy on people who are looking safety and safe jobs. I mean, you have a society now, like Korean society, where people, because the job is so unsafe and stable, people don't get married, they don't have children. Like, people are not so happy. So what is the purpose of a good economy? Is it just to have a good number on the GDP? No, the purpose of an economy is to make people happy. And job safety is important.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I'm not talking about the size, I'm talking about the numbers of people that are trying to get into that sector when you have a 1 in 40 chance. More of those people should be encouraged in a way. If there was more of an entrepreneurial spirit in South Korea, you wouldn't have 40 people seeking one job.
Okay, let's have a look at some numbers. According to data from the OECD, the number of civil servants in South Korea as a proportion of its total workforce is much lower than the OECD average. Do you think this suggests that perhaps having a larger public sector workforce is not a bad thing for South Korea?
I mean, it's always difficult to give an opinion as an outsider. There is always an equilibrium within a country.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's good to give a first opportunity to young job seekers. We had this in France, actually. We had a similar policy for a while where the government was hiring temporarily, but just to give them a first professional experience, and then they can build on that to continue their career. So
in the private sector?
Or anywhere, but it really helps. I see many areas where you can probably hire more people, like a healthcare for the elderly. I'm sure there is a lot of things that can be done to help people. So, I mean, why not? It's very difficult for me I'm not an economist, but on the philosophical level, I say it could work, yes.
I totally agree with you on both of these points. One of the, I think, troubles with the public service here is that massive test that they all take. And I think that having sort of a more diverse approach to filling positions in the public service would benefit everybody where people were more targeted to specific tasks, and also another way of being employed by the government, even on a temporary basis or on a contract basis would be better.
Okay. Now, despite these increase in the number of public sector jobs, it's still extremely difficult to land one of the jobs. It requires an extended period of time spent studying and large expenditures, with only a select few becoming successful job applicants. Test takers also have to study a wide range of different subjects, usually between 5 and 7, depending on the type of exam. How are civil servants chosen in France?
There is different ways. Of course, there is national exams, but the competition is not as big, I would say. But many people, they just hire for a specific job. Like there is a job post, and then you apply, and then you can be hired. And if you want to be hired permanently, then you have some internal exam, which is much easier. So you're not hired as a general exam. You just hire for a specific, because of your skills and because of a
Right.
specific job. And I find this more organic and maybe better fit the labor market.
What about for Japan?
I think Japan is the same as Korea, so you need to take a test, ministry by ministry,
Oh,
and
okay.
city by city, and prefecture by prefecture.
And
quite same.
is it like once a year type
Yeah,
of exam?
once a year. Yes.
Okay, so more similar
Right.
to the one here in Korea. Now, despite the surge in the number of people seeking employment in the public sector, there's also no shortage of people who view civil service with a critical eye. In Japan, what's the public's perception of those who work for the government?
Yeah, it's very stable and it is very secure. So when I was young, I have never, I don't have any idea of becoming a public servant because to me, it seems to be boring.
Boring job.
But now I regret. I should have taken that test.
Okay. Do you share that sentiment?
Actually, in France, of course, it's seen as a very stable job, but we call them civil servant, we call them fonctionnaires, and fonctionnaire has always criticized. The public image is that, oh, they're lazy, they don't work hard. And I'm kind of bothered by this. I mean, I'm a bit tired of hearing people always criticizing the fonctionnaire. Like some people, I mean, most of them are trying to do their job as much as they can, and they're the one who make the country work. So, yeah.
And is the perception in Canada good for the public sector?
I think it's similar to Fred's sentiments, but I think it depends on who you talk to, and also the position that they have within the public sector. It's a very diverse, public sector in Canada. You know, the whole medical community is mostly part of the public sector. The whole education community is part of the public sector, and certainly there are people that are very hardworking in those sectors, as well as the ordinary public servants in Canada, although they have kind of a mixed reputation, I think, in the public as well.
Okay. Now, if we come back to South Korea and have a look at its recent history, up until the 1990s, working for the public sector wasn't all that popular, but this all changed in the aftermath of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, also known as the IMF crisis. So, do you think there's a correlation between economic uncertainty and preference for public sector jobs?
Yeah, of course. Especially after 1997 or 1998, Korean companies are so Americanized. So it is so hard to find a job. Even you find a job in a big conglomerate, Samsung and LG, and you reach to 45 or mid 40s, your superior pat on your shoulder. It means thank you for your hard work. So it means you are fired. So I think to them, so public sector is very, very attractive to them in terms of security.
And when you say these companies have been Americanized, do you mean that they are let go earlier than usual?
Compared with Japanese companies, so there are a lot of similarities between Japanese companies and Korean companies. But recently, Korean companies much more Americanized compared with Japanese companies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And we have to remember that before the big conglomerates, it used to be a lifelong position. You keep this job all your life. And the correlation is obvious. When they stop these policies, and people, they want to have stable position, and they find civil sector more attractive.
Yeah. Now, we talked about the job security associated with public sector jobs, but there are other perks associated with public sector jobs. What kind of perks are there for France?
I mean, first you have usually a good pension, and it's you have as well usually long holidays. The working hours are respected. Your day finish when it's supposed to finish. You don't do long hours. So for all these makes public sector jobs attractive.
I think the same is the case in Canada. You're looking at stability. Now it's causing a little bit of a controversy because, for example, teachers, they qualify for a pension after 20 years. And it's a pretty big pension considering it just required that relatively short sort of career time frame. And people are starting to say, we're paying too much into these pensions for people that worked really for only 40 years.
In Japan, so a public sector job is very attractive to women because they are treated very well compared with private sectors.
What do you mean by treated well?
Treated as well as men. Yeah.
Okay, so there's less gender discrimination.
Yeah, that's right.
Within the
Yes,
public sector.
yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now, over in France, President Emmanuel Macron, he recently pledged to cut 120,000 employees from its public sector workforce. What's the public reaction to this?
It was bad. It was heavily criticized, first because he did a lot of tax cuts for the wealthier people, and he did a lot of taxes. It had a very business-friendly policy, so tax cuts for businesses.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he wants to cut the civil workforce. But the problem is, it's not like the public service is really good in France now. If you go to hospital, if you go to emergency rooms, you have to wait a long time. There is not enough nurses, not enough doctors. Schools could do with more professors. I mean, there is this feeling like, oh, we need more people. And the answer is to cut even more jobs. Is creating a lot of anger reaction and protests.
Then let's move now to Canada. In July of this year, CBC reported that Canada has seen a sharp rise in the number of federal employees who have been fired due to incompetence or misconduct. Why do you think there is sudden surge in the firing of public sector servants?
First, we have to look at the numbers that we're talking about here, and those surveys showed that the numbers were in double digits. So you had 55 people being fired in a previous time span, and 85 or 90 being fired more recently. And over the span of, I think, 12 years, it was like something like 2,000 people fired out of a workforce of 260,000 people, which is 1% of the workforce over a 10-year period. So still the public service sector in Canada is a really stable career.
Yeah, not as precarious as that one service
Yeah,
suggests.
that was clickbait headline. When you got into the nitty-gritty, you found out that 1% of the workforce was let go over, again, more than a 10-year period.
Now, there's also a prevailing notion that public sector jobs, they don't pay as well as the counterpart positions in the private sector. Why do you think this is so?
In Japan, so there is a very serious issue. It is a government deficit. So ratio of government deficit is against GDP is 200%. So that reason why it is it makes sense to job cut in private public sectors.
Job cut?
Yeah.
And also the salary cut? Is
Yes,
that related? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, there's not only the salary. That's the thing. Like, salary is just part of the advantages of working for the civil sector. So, given the number of a lot of people want to work for the civil sector, even though the salaries are low. So, I guess that means that the salary is probably at the level they should be.
Do you think then this low wage in the public sector could foster corruption?
Well, first off, I should say that in Canada, as I sort of mentioned earlier, the salaries that I've seen in the public sector aren't that bad. Teachers are fairly well paid in Canada, professors fairly well paid. Doctors, on the other hand, it's a different thing. We have had what was called a brain drain, where we had a lot of doctors going to the United States to work because they could make multiple times more income in the United States than in Canada, and part of the reason for that is the American medical sector is privatized, and people pay enormous amounts for their insurances. So there is a spin-off sort of negative consequence, I feel, if you're going to pay and privatize at least the medical sector of the public sector.
Yeah, I think the American health sector is a perfect example of things you should not do if you want to have proper healthcare policy. It's terrifying.
Okay. Now, in Japan, back in October, government workers in Tokyo were forced to take a wage cut, with authorities claiming that employees were being overpaid compared to their counterparts, in the private sector working similar occupations. What's the average monthly wage of a public sector worker in Japan?
I think it depends on where you work.
Okay.
If you work in Tokyo and Osaka, you will highly paid.
Okay.
So, but I think average is maybe 5 million yen. Yes, less than private companies.
Right.
Otherwise, people feel that it is unfair.
So do you think that this wage cut in Tokyo was justified?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Let's now talk about the appropriate size of the public sector in a given country. Some segments of the local media in South Korea have expressed worries about the growing number of public servants, saying other countries that have adopted a similar path have learned some very hard lessons. Meanwhile, a report from Eurostat shows that Scandinavian countries with stable economies have higher than average state employment as a proportion of its total job market. Now, you alluded to that France's public sector could possibly increase in size as opposed to decreasing, as Emmanuel Macron is suggesting. What about for Canada? Do you think the size is appropriate?
Well, I think it depends on what services you're trying to provide the public. Earlier in the program, I kind of played the devil advocating a more American-style oriented economy that, drove entrepreneurship and had less of power behind a social contract between employer and employee. But what I'd like to see in South Korea, perhaps, is a little bit more attention to what's going on in Europe and especially Scandinavia, and definitely having a larger public sector that provided more services does a couple of things. It eliminates the massive social gap and equity gap between the rich and poor in a society, and also alleviates the ups and downs that take place in the economy. So there are a couple of benefits. Certainly, I think Canada could benefit from that as well.
If I can just change a little bit. I didn't say that French should have more public servants. We already have 5.4 million public servants, like 1 over 5 workers in France is working for the government, which is pretty big. I was just explaining that maybe cuts are not appropriate given the fact that many public services are not adequately manned.
So perhaps maintain the status quo. How do you feel about the size of the public sector in Japan?
I think I heard that 1 out of 20 people are public servant.
Okay,
Yeah.
so quite low compared to France over there.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, according to a survey conducted by South Korea's Ministry of Personnel Management, a sense of duty and responsibility were the most desired traits for a public servant to have. So this is my final question. What are some of the most sought after, the ideal qualities that a public servant should have? And also, what can the government do to better foster, better facilitate, cultivate a talented and specialized public sector workforce?
Well, I think you kind of hit on it there when you said duty, and I think
Sense of duty
and responsibility, right? I think that's important in any employee that you're going to hire in the public or private sector. And one of the things that I think the public sector doesn't look for enough is people that are creative, people that are innovators. And I think the government should look for more in being more innovative in driving services and driving improvements in the services it provides to the public.
So perhaps incorporate more requirements that would gauge one's innovativeness into the entrance exams?
Yeah, sure. Well, or diversify the means with which you employ people in the public sector. I think that's the most important thing. And in South Korea, when we talk about the sunung as well, and the sort of intense monolithic system of testing that is part of the hiring process and promotion process and education process in South Korea. A very wholesale diversification of that, I think, would be to the better.
And something we didn't say enough, I think, since the beginning of this show is that a good public sector is a backbone of a functioning economy. If you want your economy to work well, you need skilled civil servants. You need them to apply the law, to help companies. You need highly skilled people. And with a sense of civil duty. The question, and to answer your question, how to foster that, I don't know. I guess it's not easy. I'm not working for the government. But maybe that's the kind of quality, as you alluded to, that's the kind of quality they should look for when they're hiring people, the sense of a civil duty. You work for your country.
Right.
In Japan, there is an attempt to recruit a good business person, successful business person.
Into the public sector.
Right, that's right. I also try to give opportunity to a person who is working in public sector in the private sector, because private sector is much more competitive in order to survive.
Right,
So
right.
there are a lot of things they can learn.
All right. Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, as we have talked about in our discussions, working for the government does carry many perks with it, whether it be job security, employee benefits, or a comfortable working environment. Be that as it may, it is hoped that those who work in the public sector will continue to remind themselves that they exist to better serve the citizens and the public. That's all we have for this week. Thank you for tuning in.